All right, she's back on the program with us. We begged her to come back on. She said, "No way, I'm not doing it." And then she was like, "All right, fine." She caved to our pressure, Nick. She's a
She mostly was about asking about you. Like, are you going to be
probably,
there?
yeah.
Like the other
She's
guy,
a
fine, great. I mean, we can nerd out about presidential stuff, but
no
the white
nerding. I told
guy,
you.
I
I
don't know.
told you, cap it. No nerding out over here with all this presidential history. Anyway, she's a fantastic presidential historian. She's a co-editor, excuse me, of a new book that's coming out. Actually, it's already out. It's called "Mourning the Presidents: Loss and Legacy in American Culture." You can catch her work regularly across the television dial. Just saw her the other day on CBS News, and that's Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Dr. C, Mike Leon, Nick Severi, thank you so much for hopping back on the pod with us.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, we listen. We know we love your work here and all the stuff that you're doing because Nick's a historian, I would say, a historian buff, adjacent.
Yeah, no, I mean the historian's the person to my right on the Zoom call.
Right.
I just nerd out about that stuff,
Right.
like those memes that we just saw earlier on Twitter of the presidential caricatures and mullets. But
right, all of that will be edited out.
Can I just say how many people have sent that to me? I mean, I love that the world knows my sense of humor and understands the way to my heart, but so many people sent that to me and it made my morning.
You're gonna have to now answer the question, which one was your favorite?
Well, I think the one that surprised me the most was Biden because he looks so different. And I was like, some of them you can really tell who this is supposed to be because frankly, their hair wasn't all that different and they just slapped some sunglasses on them. But I was like, wait, who is this supposed to be again? But of course, I get the most amusement out of some of the early ones that I spend a lot of time looking at their real portraits. And so then to see the hilarity that is this was quite useful.
Well, I want to get into your new book out that I just mentioned. Well, you were just talking a little bit about it, kind of. Why don't you give our audience kind of the elevator pitch about this book? Tell us about it. I just mentioned it before, Mourning the Presidents. And obviously, we're going to get into potentially a president that currently is under hospice right now later on. But give us a little bit about the book and what compelled you to kind of jump in on this.
Yeah. So the thing that was so motivating to me when I was exploring this project with my co-editor, Matthew Costello, it really came around the time that George H.W. Bush died. And when he passed away, we realized as we were looking around that all of these people were talking about him in a way that was really designed as a reflection of who was actually in the White House. The things people were choosing to focus on, George H.W. Bush's kindness, his decency, his humility, the stability on the world stage, a time where bipartisan politics was possible. These were all things that were designed to emphasize that we were living in a time that was quite different from the one that Bush 41 had occupied, and that political world no longer existed. And people were expressing this with great sadness. And so we kind of had this conversation that was like, has this happened at other times? Because that says so much about the American people and American culture and who we are as a nation and what we fear and what we want and what we're looking for. And indeed, it has happened time and time again. And in fact, every time a president dies, the way that the American people respond to that event often says a lot more about them than it does that person. And so that's really the goal of the book, is it has 12 presidents, the ones you would expect and maybe some that you wouldn't. And it looks at what happens immediately after. What does that say about the moment the country is in? And then how has their legacy evolved over time? And what does that process look like?
With that in mind, when you think about these 12 essays and just in the work you've done on the research end, which presidents do you feel have received perhaps maybe the most, I guess for lack of a better phrase, the best PR makeup posthumously, where our perceptions are X? I always think about Nixon's, for example, the obituaries that we read, and just the national perception of someone who rightfully was notorious in American history. But in the work you've done on this book and just in other spaces as it relates to presidential history, which presidents stand out to you as our perceptions just seem to just drastically change upon their passing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Nixon is a really great example of how he tried for a really long time to rewrite his narrative, and so did Hoover. Those are two that really really worked hard to recraft what the narrative would be when they passed away. And I think that they might have been successful in the short term in that there were some nice op-eds about them, but their legacy and what is said about them in the history books is pretty similar to what was said when they left office. I think there are two presidents, actually neither of which we covered in this volume, that have done the most spectacular job of rewriting their legacy. One is the president we are waiting to mourn, which is Carter, and two is John Quincy Adams. And that's because he went on to have this phenomenal post-presidential career in Congress as a stalwart abolitionist and really fighting the slave power. The ones that I think that are perhaps loved, but not necessarily loved in accordance with what actually happened. A great example of this in the book is Ronald Reagan. And that's because Reagan and his family and Nancy did such a phenomenal job of shaping his legacy, and the funeral process was a part of that. It was mourning in America, and when the United States could be proud of what it was, and American people could be proud to be citizens, and he was the happy warrior. And I think some of those things have certainly had a ring of truth to them, but they weren't necessarily the whole story.
I got a question on Reagan there. I'm going to save it for the end because you kind of opened the door a little bit about Jimmy Carter. I led with it at the top about the book, Mourning the President, how apropos, again, whenever this does come out, hopefully the president is still with us, but right now he's in hospice care. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what you make of Jimmy Carter's presidency? And is he one of the more notable presidents? It appears like he's been known more for his career after being president than before. Give us a little bit of your takes on Carter's presidency overall and his legacy.
Yeah, so I think Carter's presidency is really underappreciated. It's not to say that there weren't bad things, for sure. I mean, of course, every administration has rough moments, and his are particularly notable, but some of the bad things, like the inflation that he's known for, he had nothing to do with. The inflation was already spectacularly high before he came into office, and actually should receive a lot of credit for appointing someone to the Federal Reserve that took steps to try and cut down that inflation. And that person, actually, Reagan did keep in office once he came into the presidency as well. A couple of other examples, he took really important steps on environmental preservation. He was one of the first presidents to take action in light of evidence of global warming. He took really important strides on civil rights. He actually spent more on defense than almost any other president after him, and including Reagan didn't actually increase defense spending because Carter was already spending so much. So there's a lot that I think gets forgotten about his legacy, and that's partly because Reagan was such a phenomenal communicator and Carter wasn't necessarily. And so Reagan gets a lot of credit for things that Carter already had in the works. And I think part of the issue, and we've seen this with Carter's post-presidential life, is he's so humble and he's so honest and he's so straightforward that is not a very good sales approach, if you will. And sometimes the presidency needs to be a salesman. Sometimes the presidency needs to make a case and be uplifting and be positive and be a cheerleader for the country. And instead, Carter told Americans to put on a sweater and, turn down the thermostat and it would be fine, which is not really a message that I think Americans like to hear very much. So, I think his presidency is really underappreciated. His post-presidential life is so extraordinary. And partly that's because he was a young man when he was in office, or relatively young. And he's lived such a long time that he's had so much opportunity to do things. But he's really made the most of it. He is almost single-handedly responsible, or his foundation is, for ending the guinea worm epidemic in Africa, for ending river blindness, which have saved millions of lives. He's helped broker peace deals across the globe. He has helped with recovery efforts when there have been natural disasters. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And he taught Sunday school almost every week up until I think a couple weeks ago. So I think the reason he's so remarkable is because he just seems so almost not presidential in the way that he behaves on a day-to-day basis, yet has accomplished such extraordinary things.
Quick break here. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you could see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee, since 2009, this Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'll read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here of fresh roasted coffee. I always record with it. Nick, why don't you tell the people, you're a coffee snob, why don't you tell the people why they should head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee.
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. If you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show.
When you think about we talked earlier about like people's perceptions nationally, but just turning to you for a moment, when you think of these 12 presidents profiled in this book and throughout your research, which president stand out to you as for your own self of what your knowledge of that president was, perhaps, in your work prior on the research side, just as a student of history, that in looking at those 12 essays and others where you yourself experienced change in the way you perceive that person and their impact?
So I think there were two. The first was the chapter on FDR by David Woolner. One of the points that David makes so eloquently, and I hadn't really processed because, of course, didn't live through it myself. FDR was in office for such a long time and during so many pivotal moments. So, he was in office for 12 years, but those 12 years contained 100 years worth of lived events in terms of the New Deal and the New Deal state and the Great Depression and World War II, of course. And so there was a whole generation of Americans. If we think about when we start to have political memories, usually it's somewhere between like 6 and 10 years old. There was a whole generation of Americans who had never experienced any other president when he died. And he was so good at communicating and making people feel like he saw them as individuals and he heard them as individuals, largely through his, I think, fireplace chats, which were using technology in a new way that presidents really hadn't done to speak directly to Americans. And so the impact for people of his death, the shattering effect that it had on their sense of stability and the nation's future, I hadn't fully grasped until I read that chapter. The second one is the Reagan chapter. And the reason that this one really affected me, and this was written by Chester Patch, Reagan's death was not a surprise. Reagan was slowly dying of Alzheimer's. Everyone knew it. He had said goodbye publicly a long time before. And yet something about that like private, sad deterioration, the closing in of a world on someone who had been so global a figure, who had been such a brilliant communicator and could connect with people in such a charismatic way, was really sad. And, it wasn't a surprise to me. I knew what happened, but it was really sad. And I was not expecting to be that moved.
Speaking of the party of Reagan and Lincoln, oh, what a great transition, Mike. Thank you. I will pat myself on the back because Dr. Chervinsky, I saw you. Golf clap is fine. Dr. Chervinsky, I saw you on TV recently, and they had you on for something that you shouldn't have been on for. You should be on for this, what I'm about to ask you right now, because I would love to know what a president, especially a lot of Republicans, some that have been on this program, like to invoke former President Reagan and say the party has shifted away from what he used to stand for, right? Even though the slogan, Make America Great Again, has made a return here. Marjorie Taylor Greene wants a national divorce. What do you think some of these presidents would say? Because I haven't publicly heard President Biden comment on this. And again, I don't know how relevant it is to comment on a representative of Congress making a claim about the country splitting up. And we covered it on the last episode. She talked a little bit about it's not necessarily a civil war, but we're getting there close. What do you think some of these presidents that you've profiled in this book would say about such a plan from a member of Congress? And has there been a time in our history, obviously there has, when somebody has done this on the floor of the House?
Yeah. So, I think I'm really torn because I suspect that a lot of the reason she says these things is because then she becomes a news story for, 10 cycles. And that's exactly what she wants because it drives up her political fundraising numbers. And so I'm sort of loath to give her the attention. And I suspect the president will not comment on it because he is loath to give her the attention. However, if he were to, I suspect Biden would echo comments that would be made by, I think, almost every single president, with maybe the exception of one in the volume, which would be Zachary Taylor. I think Zachary Taylor maybe would be slightly ambivalent about this answer just because of when he served and his unwillingness to take a firm stance to try and resolve the major tensions of the 1850s. But every other president would say, absolutely not, that is unacceptable. The Union is stronger together than it is apart. Americans have more in common than they do different. It is essential that we continue to work together. I imagine the more recent presidents would point out the folly in this idea, in that how are you going to split up states like Georgia, which is ruby red in some particular districts, but also has Atlanta, which is bluer than blue? How are you going to split up a state like Florida, which also has blue cities and large red populations? So as a practical purpose, it doesn't make any sense. As a goal to improve the nation, it makes no sense, because the nation is much better with all of the states, because we are very large. We are a very wealthy nation. We are a very powerful nation. We are blessed with two relatively friendly neighbors and two very big oceans. And most countries don't have those advantages, and we would be an idiot to squander them. And we really, truly, the biggest threat to our success is divisions like these and people who are trying to exacerbate them.
Very well said.
Oh, there was a part of the question you didn't I didn't answer.
I
part
didn't
of the
even
question
know.
I did not. Well, good. I probably shouldn't say that, but there has been a time when national division seemed like an interesting idea. There have been a couple of times when the idea has surfaced. It first surfaced during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and he squashed that idea. This was the nullification debate. It then surfaced, of course, again in the Civil War. And one president, James Buchanan, he didn't do anything per se to encourage it, but he did nothing to discourage it, which is why he's always in the bottom three of the presidents.
We both know the work that you've done. Friends and family, we were talking obviously about the social media postings in relation to presidents that you get sent. Are you ever in situations where just socially people, just reach out to you, or you're at a dinner party or something and people just want to ask random questions, or like, which president do you often get questions about?
Yeah, people ask all the time, which I appreciate. I mean, I love that people are interested in history. That's such a gift. If not, then I would probably be out of a job. So it's great that they want to know more. People often want to know about Nixon. They find his personality puzzling. People often ask how they should think about presidents like Washington and Jefferson that played such an extraordinary role in the founding of the nation and yet owned people. They want to know how they should think about that and how to process that. And then there's always the real life version of the, well, actually. And it's not that they actually say, well, actually, it's that they want to try and come up with a piece of trivia that they know the answer to that I don't know the answer to, which if that makes them feel better, then that's just fine.
You were much nicer about that than most people be.
I am delighted to learn new facts, and if they want to share them, great.
Before we let you go, Dr. C, I wanted to ask you, because you were alluding to this John Adams book, and obviously I worked at HBO once upon a time, and we had a docu-series on the
phenomenal one.
Yes, you're welcome. I had no part in that. So tell us a little bit about what this book entails and the former president.
Absolutely. Well, there have been a lot of words spilled on John Adams, and rightfully so, because I think he's such a pivotal figure in American history, but most biographers don't spend much time on his presidency, and they treat it as the low point of his political service career. And that's understandable, because for a long time, I think people didn't fully appreciate what he did offer. And it wasn't until January 6th and what I saw for the first time with my own eyes, what it looked like to have a violent transition, did I fully appreciate all of the steps that he took to both create the practice of a peaceful transfer of power, to start to establish that norm, which had to be crafted from scratch and took decades to become a thing, but also to preserve the presidency and the nation after Washington, because it's fine and well to create something, but any founder knows that the passing off of the baton to someone else is actually usually the weakest moment in a company's existence. It's the weakest moment in a new nation's existence. And Adams had to figure it out with only one model, which was, of course, Washington. And that's an almost impossible task. And everyone knew that whoever came second, it was going to be terrible. And it was totally terrible. And yet he persevered. He made a lot of choices that were not necessarily beneficial to his political career, but were right for the country, established essential political norms, and then left when he lost. And that shouldn't be the high bar that it is, but he did it. And he never for one moment took for granted how important those practices were to a republic. And I think most people, myself included until 2021, did take that for granted. And so his example of not doing so is, I think, really essential for us to better understand.
Well, we had David Marchik on the program about his book, which I know you're familiar with, about the peaceful transfer of power. So well said on that front. Dr. Chervinsky, she's a senior fellow over at the Center for Presidential History, at SMU. If I could talk, because that's the name of this podcast. She's also the co-editor of this book. Go get it out now wherever books are sold. Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture. You can read all of her work across any major media outlet. I love seeing some of your articles pop up on NBC News. So great work as always, Dr. Chervinsky. Continued success to you, and stay safe. And next time that Adams book comes out, we'd love to have you back on the pod.
Well, thank you so much. I look forward to that very much.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do them a favor. So hit subscribe.